How do we build a culture of repair in this country? How do we make repair feel so common sense and commonplace that just everybody knows, everybody has the skill and the will to repair harm anytime it's caused?
When I think about Juneteenth, I really think about Black people and resilience and joy. And every year on Juneteenth, it's always a celebration for me because there's just this spirit of Black people that just can't be beaten down.
What are the measures that we want to use as a society to determine not necessarily whether racism is gone, but whether structural racism has been addressed? Welcome to another exciting edition of Break Fake Rules. I have a special person on the show today. Now, you may remember Malia Becton-Consuegra from last year's season as one of the program officers at Stupski who moved a tremendous amount of additional resources due to the crisis brought upon us in 2025. Today, Malia is back for a different reason, co-hosting the show. How exciting. Is this a promotion or how do we look at this?
I wish it was a promotion, but I just got moved from the guest chair over to the co-host chair. But thank you so much for that.
Well, I'm so glad you're here. And one of the reasons we're doing this episode is because we're coming up on Juneteenth, and shortly after that, America's big 250 celebration. Do we have something to raise a glass to? 250 years in, Malia. What are your thoughts?
Well, I have to be honest. Celebrating the 250th anniversary this time is going to be a little challenging for me. But you did. We're also coming up on Juneteenth.
Yes.
And that's something that I love to celebrate. And I think when I think about Juneteenth, I really think about Black people and resilience and joy. And every year on Juneteenth, it's always a celebration for me because there's just this spirit of Black people that just can't be beaten down. So that part I'm going to celebrate. I also love to celebrate the work that we get to do in supporting grantees and communities and knowing that there are all these brilliant people out there who are working hard to solve some of our toughest challenges. So I'd like to celebrate that this year as well.
And we are going to have one of our grantees on, someone you and I both have worked with. And who is that today?
So today we'll have Aria Florant, and she's the co-founder and executive director of Liberation Ventures. And for the past 6 years or so, they've been working to raise resources for the reparations movement nationwide. They focus on research, narrative, and storytelling. They think about stories that can help change people's minds about reparations as well as policies. And they've also done a spectacular job of raising reparations to different audiences. So not only are they getting more money and more resources, they've also gotten people to think about it in different ways who previously may have been against it or not interested. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with her today.
Yeah, and I am too. And I just want to ask you now that one of the aspects of the Liberation Venture model is donor collaboration and donor collaborative models. We've done a few of these collaborative moments over the years. How do you think about the effectiveness of these models when it comes to shifting and sharing control with communities?
I think when done right, they can be really impactful. So when getting donors to think about a single challenge or a single community or a single issue all together, it takes some of this ego out of the work that we do where we don't get a chance to say like, I had this great idea, I funded this thing, and now I get to get in the spotlight for it. It's a team effort, and which it should be all along. We all care about in our funder community, we all care about the same things. So we should be working together to solve these challenges. So yeah, one example that I think about when I think about is one thing that we've participated in, which was Democracy Frontlines Fund, that's started by Libra Foundation. They brought together a bunch of funders and individual donors to contribute money and to learn and to listen to communities in the South. And they were able to move like a large amount in a very short time, a 5-year span. So things like this can be very impactful. And I'm really excited to hear about what Aria is doing over at Liberation Ventures.
Yeah, me too. And I've worked in a lot of, I've been a part of, and in some cases even co-founded some donor networks that are much smaller. collaboration is challenging. It's another level where you are, bringing together funding together, making decisions together. It is challenging. So it is extraordinary to think that both the Frontlines Fund that you referenced just a moment ago and Liberation Ventures have found ways to bring donors together. And on the Democracy Frontline Fund, I think one of the things I've loved about that one is that there is that component of learning. There's not just a requirement of co-funding, but there is co-learning, that foundation staff are traveling to different parts of the United States and meeting with organizations working on the front line. And I would imagine that has a lot of different impacts on people. So yeah, these collaborative models can be very, very successful if they are carefully facilitated, and both the organizations you've mentioned have done that. So Malia, we are getting very close to the big moment when our guest comes on. Do you want to introduce her to everyone?
Yeah, let's bring her on. Welcome, Aria, to Break Fake Rules. I'd like to jump right in with a big question that's been on my mind. Why is it a fake rule that people shouldn't support reparations? And in fact, why does this actually make good economic sense?
I don't know why that is a fake rule, to be honest, because, the word reparation, it's important to remember that reparation is a tool that has been used all over the country to build and maintain and help countries transition into or back to democracy, and in particular, multiracial democracy or democracies that hold difference in some shape or form. It is part of the UN definition of sort of how you restore after gross human rights violations. And so I say that because it's so common sense, actually, for so many communities. Germany actually still pays reparations to descendants of Holocaust victims. Reparations have been used in countless Latin American countries, New Zealand, South Africa. And it's never perfect, never, often not kind of as comprehensive as it should be. But for some reason, the word is only toxic when it's applied to Black Americans. And that, to me, I think is one of the biggest sort of indicators of that's a fake rule. Because in the beginning, when LV started, we got some feedback from folks that said, like, do you really have to use that word? And we always thought it was really important because to not use the word would be essentially undermining the dignity that Black Americans deserve with regard to the harms of slavery and its legacies. The purpose of reparations is to make amends for harm. And we view reparations as also critically important for building a just multiracial democracy. And I think too often when we talk about the issue of reparations, people say, oh, it's too hard, it's too big, it's too complicated. How could we ever figure it out? And the fact is that's what government is for. And we have done so many hard things in the past. We have made a decision to go to the moon before we knew how to go to the moon. And we figured out how to go to the moon. We put the will behind it, we put the resources behind it. And so the conversation, I think what this fund does illustrate is that the conversation about reparations being too complicated is really just a distraction from the core problem, which is that we haven't yet built the political and public and cultural will to do it.
That's a really great point you make, Aria, about people being able to do really hard things in a short amount of time when they have the will to do so. And I think about foundations funding repair and all of the barriers that are stated to doing so. And it looks like a lot of funders only fund things once they're obvious and ripe for investment or when they become a crisis. So what do we lose when we're reactive like this instead of being proactive?
Oh my gosh, we lose so much. In particular, we lose the biggest thing I think is the ability to be thoughtful and strategic, but also coordinated, like to operate collectively. Because operating collectively requires relationship building, it requires infrastructure, it requires trust across people, across organizations. It requires building a shared analysis of the problem, building a shared perspective on the solution. It requires people kind of working through what their roles are in a certain ecosystem and then figuring out how to play those roles really, really well, and work with other people playing different roles, right? And when you don't have the time to actually really plan, build the ecosystems, build the relationships that you need to then act collectively, and you don't have the resources to do that, then we're forced into these moments where we're all kind of acting in a, kind of reactive, urgent, rapid response kind of way. I think the biggest thing is acting collectively. And then what I'll also say, I'll draw a connection to to Liberation Ventures work around America's 250th. So we've been trying to raise money for this since like late summer of last year, and therefore had a really tough time planning like what we would actually be able to do. And we're now getting grants in the door like just in the last week or two, when our campaign is slated to start in a few weeks. And it's just so much harder for us to be successful and to put the money where it's going to really best be used, than if we could have planned starting last August. And that's not to say, I mean, we will still use the money well, let me be clear. But I think, the lack of like advanced planning essentially that we were able to do because we didn't know how much money we would have really impacts how much, how much we're able to do. I'll also say it's tough. I hesitate to say that obviously because giving money late should never be a reason why you don't give money at all. And I don't want to say that. Um, and I think there's just, a way that we can hold ourselves accountable to giving money as early as we can.
So the question I have for you is, as you talk about this issue, and I think there's a communications aspect to this that I know you're very focused on. How much of this type of analysis are you pulling into your communications related to how extraction has taken place, transfers of wealth, who ultimately holds power as a result?
Yeah, this reminds me something that we talk about a lot is just it's a in the similar vein, but maybe just a little different, which is just the fact that the racial wealth gap is widening, and most people don't know that. Most people think, it's closing, we're making progress, we're just sort of, we're going slow, but that's the nature of progress. Um, and that's not true at all. We're going backwards. One critique that I have of like the broader social sector actually is the number of organizations you can find out there that say that they are closing the racial wealth gap through a intervention that really by like will never be able to be at the scale that could actually close the racial wealth gap is huge. And I think actually there's an intellectual dishonesty that we have around like what it will actually take. Um, I mean, Black folks have about an eighth of the wealth of white folks in terms of a typical Black and typical white family, and we are really focused on the federal government on this point because it really is the only entity that can operate at the scale of the problem, that can create a solution that's at the scale of the problem. And that solution doesn't have to be a 1-year thing, doesn't have to be a 5-year, doesn't have to be a 10-year. We can think about that over a long period of time that is feasible for the government. But the way we are operating right now, things are just getting worse. They are not going to get better. I also think that the ways that slavery and its legacies still have their tentacles in how our democracy functions. So, for example, the way that anti-Black narratives can be used as a wedge and an issue that gins up votes in particular for the Republicans, but I will say I think both sides do this. That to me is the link between why repairing the harms of slavery and its legacies not only benefit all of us, but help create a a democracy and a governance structure that then actually can contend with the ways in which this wealth transfer is happening, the way that the most powerful people are becoming even more powerful. Imagine if Trump couldn't talk about, Black folks or Haitians in Springfield on the campaign. He wouldn't, because it just wouldn't work. Imagine living in a world where anti-Blackness just didn't work to get people to do certain things, where you couldn't use narratives of criminality, couldn't make people just afraid and voting based on their fear. That's the world that we are working toward. That's the world that we believe repairing the harms of slavery and its legacies will get us to. And that, to me, is also sort of the connection for why I think we have to care, even amidst all these, so many other challenges that we're facing right now, because the fact that we haven't repaired those harms is just such a core deep issue in how our country operates.
So, Aria, with Liberation Ventures, you all have been doing some of that really pivotal work to move the nation towards this future that's rooted in repair. What led you to creating a donor collaborative model, and how did you know that was right for the work that you wanted to do?
I believe deeply that donors are whole humans that can and should use more than their money to be beneficial to movements. And we have learned a lot from other at-scale movements that have been successful over, in particular, long periods of time, like multiple decades. One example is marriage equality. They had a donor collaborative that created a container for donors to build relationships with each other, stay accountable to each other, and also stay accountable to the movement, in particular when the movement weathered losses. It was a way that they could together sense make about those losses, what they learned, and then figure out how to essentially come back stronger instead of feeling defeated and retreating. And I feel like that's the purpose of community all the time, right? It's like how you stay engaged, how you stay feeling like there's some hope when you're doing things with people side by side who share your values and your hopes and dreams for the world. We wanted to build a collaborative or a structure that essentially would enable our donors to not just be giving with their money, but also support essentially collaborative work that they could do together that would further the movement in other ways as well. And our goal is to really sustain that for the long term. We want them to be able to have a place to go where they can, make sense, make meaning together, where they can make sense, make meaning with us and with our movement partners, and essentially just build a much more transformational partnership through that structure.
And you mentioned the marriage equality movement. And for many of us in this country, when we hear love is love, it's yes, that's common sense. And I know it took decades for
Hmm.
that movement to get there. What can we learn in terms of moving the needle on reparations so it's no longer a dirty word from the marriage equality movement?
Yeah, we're doing so much. We talk to them all the time, and we are we are learning. And to be clear, we don't try to emulate every single thing that they do. We are learning from what worked and what didn't, both what they thought would work in the moment and sort of where we're at right now. But we know that they put a big emphasis on changing people's hearts and minds, really changing the culture around how people viewed marriage equality. And that, to me, is one of it's a big lesson that we take. We believe that policy change is really only as durable and only as possible as the culture change that comes along with it. So a huge part of our work is really trying to figure out, how do we build a culture of repair in this country? How do we make repair feel so common sense and commonplace that just everybody knows, everybody has the skill and the will to repair harm anytime it's caused? And we're doing that not only at the macro level, through our roles and positions and systems and institutions, but we're doing that on the micro level. We're doing that with our spouse or with our parents or with our kids. And actually, I think that's one way I love to sort of enter this conversation is, think about how important repair is in your marriage, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
It's just as important on the macro level. So To answer your question, we're doing a lot of learning in different ways about how, what kinds of things talking about repair and reparations kicks up for people. We launched a reparations narrative lab a few years ago that has gone through multiple phases of developing sort of the full set of narratives and stories and messages that we really want to tell a full story of this movement and of this issue, and then really going through qualitative and quantitative research to test those and try to understand where audiences are on them. And what we have now is what we call a belief arc, which is essentially the process that people go through from being in full opposition to being in full support of reparations. It doesn't, what we've learned from the research is it doesn't just turn on or turn off. People build a deeper and deeper understanding of the problem, and then they build a deeper and deeper understanding of the solution, and in particular, um, hope in the possibility of the solution. And so we are now in the process of we're running a campaign that's going to launch on Juneteenth. So follow Liberation Ventures on socials to pay attention to that. It'll be called Beloved Repair. And we have resourced over 20 projects across the country that are focusing on different audiences along that belief arc and trying lots of different things to move them along the belief arc.
You all, I just have to say, you've been doing an excellent job in researching, gathering stories, and trying to get information out that can change hearts and policies in this country around repair. My question is, why is this work especially important now as we prepare to celebrate the 250th anniversary of this country?
I think we are contending for the meaning that folks make about the founding of this country. And we are certainly the David in this David and Goliath situation right now, given that, given who is in the White House and the sort of megaphone that comes with that. But what I in particular have learned from our narrative research is that it isn't just about convincing someone of a solution. It's really about their fundamental understanding of the problem. And that, I think, is what is in the zeitgeist right now in the context of America's 250th. Like, who are we? How were we founded? What is the gap between the actual, the between slavery and between the actual like ideals that were written into our founding documents? And how do we understand or not the need to close that gap still? And how do we understand or not our own agency and our own role in doing that? Um, and I think that the way that people make meaning of America this year, it will either give us tailwinds or headwinds as broader social justice movements, not even just on reparations, for decades, I think.
The Supreme Court, in the decision they just had around voting rights, made kind of a majority statement that racism is over in America to some degree. It's kind of how they, it's a simple way of cutting to it. And I was listening to a commentator shortly after that decision, and white guy. I don't know how up and in the reparations conversation he is, but he disagreed with the Supreme Court. I would put him more in the middle to right, ideologically. And he disagreed with the Supreme Court. He said, in his opinion, racism is still very present. But the question he had is, what are the measures that we want to use as a society to determine not necessarily whether racism is gone, but whether structural racism has been addressed?
And we see just across so many different indicators, overall life outcomes, whether it's health, whether it's jobs, whether it's earned income, whether it's wealth, that they are not equal. There are so many studies too that, articulate the structural nature of that. And the historical nature of that, the sort of intergenerational nature of that. But I think that's how we actually should be measuring progress. Like, am I more likely to die from giving birth than the white woman next door who is also 37 and, blah, blah, blah? Like, I still am. And we should be designing for closing those gaps. We have learning to do to figure out exactly what that policy portfolio looks like. And I imagine it's a number of different things. It may include cash. I doubt that it's only cash. But I think, but we can do that work. I mean, this goes back to the we can do hard things point. But, we can actually look at, okay, when you invest in child savings accounts, for example, baby bonds for folks, what does that do? Play it forward 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, play it forward, and then look at how does that change group level outcomes between Black folks and white folks, and use that to then continue to iterate on what the policies should be.
So, Aria, what's your final fake rule that you'd encourage everyone to break?
I mean, that you can't support reparations, with your time, with your treasure, with your talent. I think about this. When we started this work, as I said, people were like, are you going to be able to raise money for this? And we really didn't know, but we thought, let's try. And the experience over the last 6 years has been, my image for it is like being in a really dark room where at first you think the walls are really close by because it's so dark, but then as you have the courage to like put your arm out or jump up or like move your leg or walk around or run around, you realize that you're in this like cavernous space. And that to me has been actually sort of like my experience. I am constantly talking to people who are like, well, I support reparations, but I don't think my family does, or I don't think my boss does, or I don't think the board does. And then I will go and talk to somebody who could just as well be their board or in their family. And I hear again, well, I support reparations, and it feels like there's this like cultural expectation that like we're alone, that we're like the only ones who support it. And we're just not. I mean, public support for reparations right now stands at around 36%, which is actually about 9 percentage points higher than support was for marriage equality when that movement coalesced. But for some reason, people kind of feel like they're going to get laughed at if they really talk about reparations publicly or with their friends or with their colleagues. And I just want to go back to that intellectual honesty point. Like, we need to be honest about what it's going to take to actually solve this problem. And that to me is the thing that we should be standing strong in and having courage around. And the other thing I'll say is that we've always had explicitly a collective approach to this work. Some people ask me, why don't you have an all-Black team? And my snarky response is, because Black people didn't cause this problem. So we shouldn't be all on our own to solve it. And I think that is a really important thing to remember, in particular in this climate right now as well, that we should be contending for the hearts and minds of everyone. This is not just about Black people, and all people can and should be doing this work, and in particular doing it in their own communities with their own people, because we know that peer-to-peer organizing is one of the most effective ways to change culture. So the fake rule, I guess, is that you can't do that. We got to do that.
Thank you so much for joining us, Aria. So many great points. We've been checking in over the years on this movement, and I can see how much you're starting to get more and more of a handle on how we're going to get there. And I think, for everyone at Stupski, certainly Malia, who is a powerful force in this work as well, I know we're all really pleased with the partnership and very hopeful that we can see more and more progress on this front. So thank you for joining us on Break Fake Rules.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.